Ever since the crucifixion of Lord Jesus Christ, it became a pious practice for his followers and believers to make the pilgrimage to the city of his demise. For centuries they were able to do so undeterred, even by the Muslim occupants. But by the 11th century, they had become hostile to the Christian commerce. In 1096, Christendom responded to Islam by launching the First Crusade, occupying the Holy City. A group of charitable merchants from Amalfi had spent the previous few decades trying to construct hospices for the pilgrims, and with the conquest of Jerusalem, they became known as Hospitallers, establishing the order of Saint John. Their symbol was the 8-pointed cross, representing the 8 Beatitudes, with 4 arms symbolic of the 4 virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. By 1191, the order had taken on a militant character, as armored men were needed to protect the pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. Thus they became the Knights Hospitallers, and they called each other frater, brother. However, the Crusades were a failure, and the knights were expelled from Jerusalem, ending up on the island of Rhodes, acquired in 1309. Control of the island turned the knighthood into a sovereign state, with the assignment to tend to the poor, heal the sick, and wage perpetual war against Islam. Rhodes being an island, this conflict was primarily fought by sea in oar-powered galleys, and it didn't take long for the knights to develop into excellent seamen. It took 2 centuries for Islam to strike back in force, when the Ottoman Empire landed on Rhodes in 1522 and violently expelled the order. Rallying at a convent in Syracuse, the order implored the King of Spain, Charles V, to give them the island of Malta, which he did in return for the order protecting the city of Tripoli. Malta was considered a barren rock, frequently harried by the Barbary corsairs, and the idea was that the knights would function as a wooden wall to protect Christendom from the depredations of these Mohammedan rovers. They became the policemen of the Mediterranean, seeking out pirates and corsairs and liberating Christian captives. However, many soon realized the profit to be had from ransoming Muslim captives, or taking them as slaves. These made up a convenient labor force aboard the galleys, whose heavy oars demanded substantial manpower. The knights soon took on a more piratical character, raiding the Muslim coasts for profit, with many of the grandmasters using the order as a private fleet to enrich themselves. The order developed close ties with the Kingdom of France, and it became customary for French aristocrats to spend their youth in service of the order. Here they developed substantial maritime skills, and could then go on to become naval officers in service of the Ancien regime. One such fellow was Philippe de Lonvilliers, the Seigneur de Poincy. Born in 1584, he had spent his youth in service of the order, before returning to France as commander of the Breton squadron. He lost his position following a dispute with the Archbishop of Bordeaux, and spent most of his time idling in Paris. It was then that he was offered to become governor of the French Antillean Isles. In 1627, a pirate named Pierre de Esnambuc had established a colony on the island of St. Kitts, and by 1637, the French had expanded to control several of the tiny islands in the Lesser Antilles. Pierre had recently perished, and the company in charge of running the operation was looking for a successor. They decided to appoint René de Beculat, the Sieur de Lagrange, as governor-general, and although he initially accepted, he soon offered a position to Poincy, who was so glad to accept it that he even paid Lagrange a small sum of money. I guess he really wanted to get out of Paris. Poincy arrived on St. Kitts in 1639, greeted by enthusiasm and cannon salutes. He entered the capital of Basseterre in the uniform of the Hospitallers, his 12 guardsmen dressed in scarlet cloaks embroidered with a white cross. For the poor settlers, it must have been a sight to behold. They were honored to have such an important member of the aristocracy appointed as their governor, and gifted him a good horse as a present. Poincy was a mysterious and energetic figure, who would govern the Isles as a skilled and efficient autocrat. He did many good things, such as constructing public hospitals, much in line with the order's initial purpose. But he also did things to upset the local denizens. At one point he spirited away the beautiful daughter of a local planter, saying he was too much of a drunk to tend such a beautiful creature. She was kept in the house of Lagrange and often visited by Poincy. I wonder why. He continued to alienate them with taxes and bans on trade with the Dutch, and the people even revolted in 1642. At home, the government eventually tired of him, and in 1646 sent Patroclus de Poincy to replace him. Poincy refused the succession, leading to a short civil war. Poincy made various local alliances and prepared defenses, while Poincy landed on Martinique, gathering local forces to quash the rebellion. Many of his new allies were people spurned by Poincy, eager for revenge. Most prominent was a certain Dubarquet, who landed with a loyalist force on St. Kitts, where the people met him warmly. The next day, Poincy had raised an army of 2,000 English allies, and met Paquet in a short engagement. 60 of the outnumbered Frenchmen were killed, and the rest surrendered. Paquet fled into the forest, where he sustained himself on wild fruit. He made it to the home of a Capuchin father, but since Poincy had expected him to and placed guardsmen at the door, he had to sneak through a window. The father advised Paquet to seek out the governor on the English side of the island, who seemingly granted him asylum. But while the men were having dinner, soldiers burst inside. The governor had betrayed Paquet. He lunged over the table with a dagger, but the soldiers dragged him off, tossing him in jail. Poincy was far from popular and instituted a purge of his opponents. Those who fled into the woods were hunted with dogs, and a bounty placed on the heads of Poincy's biggest enemies, who had fled into the woods and gone guerrilla. The Capuchins were expelled, their property given to the Jesuits and Carmelites. Poincy eventually returned to France, where he fell victim to court intrigues. Poincy retained his position, but tensions continued in the Lesser Antilles. One of his most notable feats was the construction of a private dwelling, known as the Chateau. This was a fortified palace near his capital on St. Kitts, a mansion truly befitting an old crusader. Constructed in the style of an Italian villa, it rose 4 stories high and culminated in a flat roof, used as an observation platform. The villa was defended by a terrace with a low wall, armed with several cannons, and around it lay fields of sugar and ginger, tended by the governor's army of slaves. At its time, it was one of the finest buildings in the Caribbean, but an earthquake destroyed it in 1689. One of Poincy's biggest issues had been the presence of Huguenots, or French Calvinists, heretics. His solution was to offer them control of Tortuga, a distant island where they wouldn't be much of a problem to him. He gave command to an engineer and old pirate, Jon Levasseur, who took the island from the English and expelled them. However, Levasseur soon became so powerful that he essentially declared independence, making himself a pirate king on Tortuga Island. Poincy realized the problem with a powerful and independent heretic stronghold, being an old crusader and all. In 1652, he commanded Timoleon Othman, Sieur de Fontenay, to invade and retake the island. Son of a French treasurer, Fontenay joined the Order of Malta in 1631, distinguishing himself in battle against the Ottoman Turks. By 1650, he was back in French service, as captain of a 22-gun frigate, La Louise. Off the island of Jersey in the English Channel, he received a commission from the Prince of Wales to attack ships belonging to the English Commonwealth. The Prince of Wales, whose father had been executed by Oliver Cromwell, was living in exile in France, and would 10 years later return to England as King Charles II. Either way, in 1652, Fontenay was in service of de Poincy and took up the order to retake Tortuga. It wasn't as challenging as he had believed, because Levasseur had been assassinated by 2 of his lieutenants, who gladly surrendered Fontenay as the new governor. Fontenay immediately continued with his old piratical tract, and issued privateering commissions against the Spanish. He even gave one of his lieutenants command of La Louise. However, the Spanish responded to these depredations by assaulting Tortuga in 1654, and after a brutal siege, took control of the island. Fontenay and his followers were allowed to leave, but they launched a counterattack, temporarily beating the Spaniard before being forced to retreat. Fontenay returned to France, and 4 years later, he was given command of the ship Gaspard. Sailing to South America, he teamed up with Dutchman Job Forrent, captain of a small fleet. Their intention was to enter the South Pacific, but were distracted by the sight of 22 Dutch and English traders in the lightly defended port of Buenos Aires. He attempted to attack, but was beaten off. Forrent decided to desert him, and Fontenay proceeded alone to the Strait of Magellan, but was driven back by bad weather. He and Forrent joined forces again at Rio de Janeiro, and made a second attempt at Buenos Aires. They blockaded the port for 3 weeks, seemingly without any success. A trio of large Dutch vessels finally attempted to run the gauntlet, killing Fontenay and capturing his Gaspard. Forrent retreated, taking with him a single prize ship. Also in 1650, the company in control of the French Antilles was facing some monetary troubles, as in, they were bankrupt. Several of their islands, including Martinique, were sold off to Poincy's old enemy, Dubarquet. That's embarrassing. Having now lost his position as Governor-General of the islands, and possibly fearing his loss of St. Kitts, Poincy proposed to his old brothers, the Order of Malta, that they would purchase some of the islands from the company, including St. Kitts. The company didn't really care who bought the islands, they just needed money, and for 120,000 francs, they agreed to the sale of St. Kitts, and also the islands of St. Martin, St. Bartholomew, and St. Croix, all of whom had been conquered or colonized by Poincy himself. The only issue was the King of France, who might not agree to the islands switching hands to a separate, independent state. Appearing at the court, the knights made the argument that the many services they provided to Christendom made it desirable to have a second post aside from Malta to continue their work. Poincy had also used hospitaller funds for building up his colony, and the acquisition could be seen as a reimbursement. The king found it reasonable, and since the Maltese were a close French ally, he agreed, and granted them jurisdiction of the islands. However, the king remained a sovereign of the islands, and the order would have to pay a crown of gold worth 1,000 écus to each future king. Naturally, the order recognized the role of Poincy in building up the colony, and likewise his role in the sale of the islands, so he was able to keep his position as governor. However, they did send agents to represent their interests, manage the finances, and curb some of the power held by the Poincy. Like always, he staunchly resisted, and even though he was a very old man at this point, they were unable to rein him in. He attempted moves to annex his old possessions, now the private property of his old rival, Parquet. These schemes never came to fruition, and Poincy passed away in 1660, aged 76. Not bad at all. His funeral was held in hospitaller fashion. His guardsmen dressed in their scarlet cassocks with white crosses, armed with bandoliers and carbines. These carbines were possibly the rifled flintlock sort given to French dragoons, who also served as guardsmen in the home country. It appears that their dress was the earliest soldier's uniform to be seen in the Americas. The Knights of Malta had, at this point, degenerated far from their original, honorable purpose. The Grandmasters had struggled at reining in their rowdy knights, who spent most of their time plundering, spending the loot on prostitutes, or dueling each other in the streets. Attempts to imprison the prostitutes ended in the knights rebelling. They were a right piratical sort, and it wasn't no surprise that many of them ended up as Caribbean filibusters, ironically fighting their brothers of the faith, the Spanish. Le Chevalier Philippe du Plessis was a knight of Malta, commanding a 30-gun frigate commissioned by the Duke of Beaufort. Mustering a crew in Saint-Domingue, he sailed to Honduras, where he rescued a company of marooned filibusters, led by a certain Vaqueli. He then proceeded to the southern coast of Cuba, where he engaged a Spanish ship, El Santo Cristo y Angel, of the Isle of Pines. After a fierce engagement, the Spanish surrendered, and the vessel captured. However, the knight had perished in the fighting, along with 22 wounded. Vaqueli succeeded him as captain, and took the body of the Crusader back to Tortuga. Poincy was succeeded by the Chevalier de Sayles, literally the nephew of a saint, so quite befitting. His first order of business was dealing with a rebellion organized by a troublesome militia captain, Brisson, a notorious brawler and drunkard. Having gathered a party of 40 companions, his goal was to overthrow the order and have the colony be under the direct jurisdiction of the king. Mustering the militia, de Sayles marched to Brisson's plantation, where he demanded an explanation. Brisson responded in his usual manner, and the governor ordered his arrest. The captain ran for his weapons and fired at the governor with a pistol, wounding him severely. The guardsmen subdued the rebel and threw him in jail, where he was sentenced to be hung, drawn, and quartered. His head was placed on a pole in the public square. The cause for the revolt were the heavy taxes imposed by the Poincy, and having subdued the rebellion, de Sayles lowered the taxes and invited back the old enemies of the Poincy. He gave them back their property, paid back their debts, and reimbursed their losses from the coffers of the order. According to the priest, du Tertre, he was more like a father than a governor, and he was much beloved by the people. However, hospitable possession of the Caribbean Isles wasn't to last. The government had established a new company, the French West India Company, to reassert control over the islands. The reason was that French merchants were losing valuable trade to the Dutchmen, and thus revenue going to the state. With the disbandment of the old company and sale of the colonies to private governors, free trade expanded and funds were further diverted into private pockets. In 1665, the Hospitallers, having been unable to turn a profit from the Isles and owing money to the French state, were pressured to sell their Caribbean colonies. The sale was signed for 500,000 francs, almost 5 times what they had paid to purchase the Isles near 15 years prior. De Sayles was permitted to keep his post as governor, but passed away on the 22nd of April, 1666. He was succeeded by another knight, Claude Roux, who in 1682 was even appointed as Governor-General of the French West Indies. He continued his sponsorship of filibusters, but it is uncertain how many of them were of the knightly organization. If you enjoyed this insight into pirate history, support the channel by liking, leaving a comment with your thoughts, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. The channel is dependent on continuous views for its survival, and needs your support to continue publishing high-quality documentaries. Channel memberships, donations, and Patreon support help me along immensely. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.